We now come to unit number 5, where we'll be examining briefly Jewish, Christian and Islamic approaches to the study of ethics, with an emphasis upon their views of virtue and redemption. In this unit, we'll be reviewing the basic forms of deontological ethics. We'll look at the core values of a good life according to Plato and Aristotle. That'll be a revision for us. I may go through that a little more quickly because some of the slides you'll recognize are bringing them together. And the reason is I want to do the same thing in relation to the core values for the good life for Jewish, Christian, Islamic value theory. I'll come back to why I want to do that in a moment. And then I want to relate the core value of redemption. It's going to be a common theme between Jewish, Christian and Islamic value theory, and see how it impacts those approaches to deontological ethics, at least at a 65,000 foot level. And then I want us to become aware of the challenges and implications of and to the divine command theory. So that's where we're going in this particular video/lecture. Well, a brief overview. The textbook in chapter 5, which is your assigned reading, begins with the discussion of morality and religion. My discussion here today is going to end with a critical review of that, whereas the textbook begins with that. But both the textbook and what I'm setting forth for you here is that religion is one of the most influential forces in defining ethics, in defining moral values and theories. And at the heart of that, of course, is the divine command theory. I've been making a distinction, however. Most discussions, or many discussions of the divine command theory would assert that religious people, particularly Jewish, Christian, Islamic theists, would use the divine command theory to define the good life and define their value theory, in other words. Whereas I want to say it's the other way around. To understand the major theist view of divine command theory, you must begin by understanding the core common elements of their value theories, and that's just no different to what we did with Plato and with Aristotle and others. Now, this divine command theory is one of the approaches to deontological ethics. I mean, it's going to deontological ethics keep cropping up. It cropped up with Plato. It's going to crop up later with Kant, and we'll be confronted by deontological ethics. One aspect is the divine command theory. So I'll leave that for you. So first I'll begin by reviewing Plato and Aristotle's view of the good life and how their value theories developed their moral perspectives and their ethics. Secondly, we'll make some initial observations on the broad common values of the three primary influences in the West of the good life, namely Jewish, Christian and Islamic. We'll do that at a high level. Thirdly, reflect upon the impact of that broad common value upon the divine common theory. That broad common is going to be redemption. And fourthly, we'll summarize our major observations about the divine command theory, and then we'll come back for the critical evaluation at the end. So let's begin first with a summary of both Plato and Aristotle. Plato was a deontologist. That means he was a rule ethics man, and the rules were the rules made by the philosopher kings and queens. And that's because he had a view of the good life, which was a life to be lived in a social structure which was perfectly ordered and perfectly just, and governed in accordance with this abstract principle of justice, or virtue, ethics, virtue, goodness. And he took the view that while everyone had a free will, they needed to be educated into and even necessarily compelled to conform with the requirements of the perfectly ordered and perfectly just society. In other words, he's a rule ethics man. Aristotle, on the other hand, was a virtue ethics man. And his virtue came out of his value theory. He valued happiness as the natural and human fundamental, essential characteristic. It's why we're made. It's the direction of our lives. We're always seeking to be happy. Though he had an interesting view of happiness, as we noted, and that the good life was something that was achieved over a lifetime. It came about by virtuous choices using such guides as the moral mean. He is developing the virtuous life. So, while both Plato and Aristotle agree on the political nature of the individual, the free will of the individual, Aristotle viewed any form of government as being valid and proper and reasonable so long as it protected the individual's right to pursue virtuous living and would result in a good life. So let's refresh ourselves briefly. I'm going to be very quick here. The good life was based upon the concept of what it would be personally happy. Here we go, from the person to the community. For a person to be happy, the three parts of the soul need to be in balance and harmony, ruled by reason. Well, Plato surmises, then the state needs to be a reflection of the human soul, and so it needs to be ruled by reason. It needs to have people who will implement the rule, control it, and people who will live that life. The soul, of course, made up of the three parts: the rational part, the emotional part, or the spirit, and the appetitive, bodily needs. And so he divided society into three parts. And probably item 3 on the screen is the one that's most perfect here for you. The state was to be led by reason, hence philosopher kings and queens, but a rule. The character of the community, or the spirit of the community, was to be a reflection of the philosopher's view of justice, and the rules that were made to be implemented and enforced by the guardians. And lastly, people's desires were to be restrained. People need to be restrained in their desires and passions that they might live under the rule of reason. This is his fundamental view of happiness. I'm not going to spend time particularly looking at this slide, how did it affect the operation of society. You can reflect on this looking at the PowerPoint slides which are attached to refresh your memory of it. The bottom line, of course, is how did it affect his deontology. Virtue, justice, and the good were forms, those innate ideas or concepts that existed objectively and were known by everybody, but especially known by the philosopher kings and queens. They knew what they were. And the leadership's decisions and controls were made in relation to those forms. And because they were philosopher kings and queens, they all knew what those forms were. And they implemented them by issuing commands. And those commands carried with the obligation of duty. So duty was a moral good. And of course, when we had our discussion earlier of Socrates and the place of obedience to the state, we saw as a moral duty. And quite clearly, he is a deontologist. He's a rule ethics man. But the question is, what form of deontology did he follow? Here we have the 3 basic forms listed for you: mixed deontology, essentialism, and divine command theory. Well, quite clearly, he's not saying do what the gods say. And quite clearly, he's not concerned at all with considering duty and what might be the outcome. He's simply saying, here's the rule, obey it. It's defined in relation to a rational concept. So obviously he fits within the form of deontology known as essentialism. So what we see here is that his whole approach to understanding the role of deontology flows out of his view of what society is. He knows what's best, and what is best is going to be imposed on society. And hence, it's a rule. It's what must be done. Aristotle, on the other hand, is quite different. He's concerned about happiness. And really, what's in red on the screen is what is really important here. At the bottom, Aristotle's view of ethics was derived from his view of happiness. If happiness was the individual pursuing the virtuous life, learning how to make virtuous decisions, so at the end of their life they can look back and say, I lived a good life. These practiced and learned virtues took time and required a person to grow in making ethical choices. So happiness was a natural human process as far as Aristotle was concerned, which was essentially an individual being free to make virtuous choices. If that's the case, he's very concerned that people should not live under some sort of command structure, but rather they should be protected and empowered. So he would agree with Plato that humans had a free will and they were by nature political creatures and involved in the polis and the activities of the city. But unlike Plato, he viewed any form of government to be appropriate or virtuous so long as it protected the individual's freedom to pursue virtuous living and the good life. Now here again, what we see is that Aristotle's view of the good life, his value theory, drove and developed his view of ethics. And it's in that light I would turn now to these three major influencers in the West: the Jewish movements, the Christian movements, and the Islamic movements. And I'm going to be suggesting to you from various sources that there is an interesting common element in their view of the good life, the heart of their value theory. Each of them has a view of redemption. It's not exactly the same. In fact, in some ways it's different, but nonetheless has a lot of common elements to it. And I'm going to suggest to you that what's important about those common elements, it impacts the way they view the divine command theory. So let's turn first to the Jewish movements. Some of you may be well aware that there are a number of movements within Judaism: the Orthodox movement, Conservative, Reformed, and so on. And what's interesting is, in one way or another, they're all very concerned with redemption. Now, redemption here is first and foremost, in the Jewish concept, a national process where the nation of Israel is redeemed, and then it affects the person to be redeemed inside the nation of Israel. And there are impacts come from that. If you look at the right-hand box, you'll see that the good life, looked at from the perspective of redemption, was a new life, gave a new community, people being treated as moral agents. It's within that framework that traditional ethics, the Ten Commandments, is to be understood. It's evangelical in the sense that the promises to Abraham were to be to Abraham, to Israel, and to all the nations. There are moderate social concerns, they were liberal in some respects, and could even fit within the framework of secular and cultural movements, this concept of redemption. By the way, if you look at this concept of redemption and the various different groups within Judaism, you will see that they reflect different emphases in the way redemption works out. And by the way, this is going to be true of the other major players, other major movements as well. Now the Christians are the same, although the redemption here begins with personal salvation and looks toward the kingdom of heaven and the relationship with the life to come and the life in the present time and the power of the Spirit, etc. We might say the word grace comes in here. And this is a common element in Roman Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant, Anabaptist and various nonconformist traditions. Each time I'm giving you a little quote that gives you some authoritative starting point if you want to look more into this particular topic. But what's important from our perspective, again, is to see that it is this concept of redemption that again has this impact upon the development of an application understanding of the divine command theory. Again, you'll see it carries with it new life, a new community, humans as rational and responsible creatures. Again, the Ten Commandments, evangelistic, if you will, in the Christian case. Again, moderate social concerns and liberal. And you can look at all the different Christian groups, and again, just as with Judaism, the interaction between redemption and the divine command theory impacts the way that unfolds. The point being, of course, that is not divine command theory defining value theory, it's value theory defining the implication, understanding, and application of the command theory. Islam. Islam, two major groups being Sunni and Shia, Sunni being the larger of the two. These two groups separate on how they deal with early Islamic sources and the writings of Muhammad and the Qumran, the Sunni to some extent being a little more literalistic in their interpretation. However, both share in common the concept of redemption. It's really quite interesting. I've given you the authoritative quote here to give you some background to this. Is an interesting symposium held at, of all places, Brigham Young University, in which Muslim leaders and others came together to discuss the relationship between the concept of redemption in the Christian community and the Islam. And you can see the quote I've given you here from Muhammad Mustafa Aboud in his address to that conference, where he's talking about the parallel role of redemption both in Christianity and in Islam, particularly the focus on Muhammad. Now, from our perspective, we don't want to get down into the details of these discussions. All we want to see is that the way redemption is viewed, it impacts the way you see new life, the community, humans as rational agents, as rational moral agents, the Ten Commandments, traditional ethics, if you will, the promotion of religion, evangelism, and again, you see these differences. And if you look at this concept, broad concept of redemption, and look back at the various groups within Islam, not just the two major groups, but the four differing groups within Shia Islam, you'll see the different factors, emphases in redemption, the way it works out, in its application to the individual and the community, but particularly the community, helps you to understand how differing approaches and applications of the Ten Commandments, or the moral law, as it were, divine command theory, again, works out. And again, the bottom line comes back to that same thing that I've been emphasizing through this, is that the divine command theory doesn't shape theists' value theory. Value theory shapes theists' approach to the divine command theory. So let's make some observations here. The understanding and application of the divine command theory is shaped by the theist view of redemption. The divine command theory is built upon a broad conception of redemption, and not just a single set of rules. And because of this view of redemption, theists may use a conception of redemption and approach deontological ethics by moving away from an emphasis on divine command theory to even mixed deontology or even essentialism. And again, you'll see that here you get to see how the overall religious deontological approach can be confused if you don't take into account this view of the core values involved in the perspectives of the religious movements. All right, let's come back to the challenges and implications of divine command theory. Shea Slaughter sets out the two key challenges. It is said that the foundational assumptions of divine command theory, he sets them out for you in chapter 5. The religious belief, that religious belief is needed to get people to do their duty. And secondly, morality is created by God, and it's fundamentally created. Our responses and discussions to these arguments can be found in Thomas Aquinas, John Hick, Alvin Plantinga. I'm not particularly interested in getting into a debate about that. I think you need to know the arguments against divine command theory. I think if you're going on in philosophy, you need to be aware of them. I would point out to you that most of those affirming the place of divine command theory in the study of ethics would assert that the key foundations of the theory are not those stated above. In other words, there's a difference here. The difference might seem to be a fine difference, but nonetheless those who are asserting the importance of divine command theory would assert it's an important one. And the key foundations that they would see is that God is holy and righteous. That's his character. And what he speaks, what he commands, what he promises, therefore holy and righteous. In other words, morality is a reflection of God's own righteous and holy character. It's not something created, it's something that is because God is, which is different from a command theory. And secondly, it's a reflection of who he is. However, we're interested in the application and the approaches to divine command theory. We want to understand how it works. And what we've noted here is that the personal and community dimensions of redemption in all the various groups greatly impacts the way the divine command theory is applied and understood. And the differing emphases on the personal and community dimensions of redemption between the subgroups are really quite significant in terms of understanding the way deontological ethics works out, or command theory works out. And lastly, the cultural dynamics between non-religious groups and theists also means very often discussion doesn't join forces in terms of divine command theory or ethical theory at all. And yet, it's important to realize that it probably is one of the most important influences of people's views of what is morally right. If you were to ask people in the community what is morally right and wrong, a great majority would tend to say the Ten Commandments and the golden rules that Jesus spoke about in the New Testament. So it is really quite important to realize that in understanding and discussing these issues, understanding the role of redemption can help us appreciate some of the distinctions being made and help us to understand what people are arguing for. And from our perspective, in evaluating their arguments, because as ethicists we want to try and evaluate the rational justifications for positions people take, which is exactly what you see taking place in the textbook. And I commend the chapter 5 to you as a supplement. You'll see that this lecture has been very different from that in the textbook, and it's meant to be to give you an overview. Well, what do you need to know from Unit 5? You need to know and identify the three basic forms of deontological ethics. You need to identify the core values of the good life for Plato and Aristotle. Back to that again. Know and identify the common core values of the good life for Jewish, Christian, and Islamic value theories. That's redemption. You might notice the subtle differences that we saw as we're going through the slides. Be aware and be able to identify the challenges and implications to the divine command theory. You need to be aware of what the arguments are in that subject. Well, thank you for watching. And again, in preparing for tests, this slide you can see here, the red slide as I call it, or the red sheet, this is the one you have to focus on because the test questions will be based around this kind of issue as understood in light of this lecture. Thank you and appreciate you watching.